Times, like last week, with a person suggesting that doctors should be forced to perform transgender surgery simply based on wants, not even based on an assessment of need. The doctor should not be able to assess whether somebody needs the transgender surgery or whether it will be...
Well, that's basically the situation in Ontario already in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's on demand. It's just like any other optional surgery.
Yeah.
I mean, this sort of stuff has real societal consequences, and so what the left will do is they don't want to talk about the societal consequences. Instead, what they do is they say, you're not welcome in the conversation because you're unsympathetic. And so this is usually what's thrown at me. And you know, fairly enough in the sense that my slogan is facts don't care about your feelings, but what I mean by that is not that you shouldn't care about other people, it's that in the end, the solutions that are going to lead to better lives are not going to be feelings-based, they're going to be facts-based. This does not mean I have to be an unsympathetic human being. So for example, there's a story that I really haven't told publicly because I don't like to tell these stories publicly because Maimonides has a basic principle of charity, which is the best form of charity is anonymous charity because then you don't get credit for it. So I don't want to make it seem like this happened simply because I was trying to take credit for it. But several weeks ago, I was speaking at a university which will remain unnamed for anonymity reasons. And this topic came up. A transgender person got up at the microphone and asked a question. And the conversation kind of went sideways. The person suggested, they started talking about their personal story, and I started kind of picking holes in the personal story a little bit. And it's probably an exchange that I could have handled better. But in any case, the person got very upset and started to cry and then left. And it was all on tape. And it was one of those situations where because I give speeches in Q&A forums and because there are a lot of videos of me destroying people, it's one of those situations where if the tape comes out, it gets 5 million views and Shapiro destroys transgender.
Right.
And I don't want that to be what happens at my lectures. If there's going to be a Shapiro destroys video, which we don't even cut, then I would like it to be like just a rational exchange where everybody leaves feeling good about the exchange and somebody lost and somebody won. Fine. This was something different. The person got visibly emotionally upset, very upset, and the people who were running the event happened to know who the person was. So I called the person up on the phone, and I said, that really didn't go how I wanted it to go. You know, I have my public position, but that doesn't mean I don't have sympathy for you. I went to the organizers of the event, I had them cut that part out of the tape because there's no reason this person should be exposed to ridicule. And then I had coffee with the person the next morning to ensure the person was doing okay emotionally. Okay, that's not coming from a place of I don't care about people. This is coming from a place of these are important, vital public conversations. And shutting down those conversations by saying that I don't care about a human being, that I don't care about what happens to people, is the nastiest form of no platforming because it's not just saying you don't deserve a platform for your views because your views are so terrible and so awful. It's saying that your views are inherently evil. Yeah. They're inherently sociopathic.
And you are too.
And you are too. And that's something that I think is actually a form of assholery beyond comprehension.
I also don't think that you can care for people. I think that you can care for individuals. And I mean, one of the things that's been characterizing the tour that we've been doing is that, like when I'm lecturing, I don't lecture to the audience. I lecture to individuals, and I'm not lecturing to them either. That's the wrong way because I always include myself in the discussion. So if we're talking about ethical principles and how they might be, what would you call it, put forward or founded more solidly, then I'm always including myself in the list of perpetrators who need some improvement, right? So it's just discussing with people one at a time, even though they happen to be very large audiences. And then when I see people afterwards, because I meet about 150 people after each talk, then I get not a huge amount of time, but enough time to make personal contact with each person. And I'm very careful to do that extremely carefully because I'm very happy they're there. And they often tell me a story about, you know, how they were suffering in some way or things weren't set right in their life. And that they've been trying to develop a vision to aim high at something that's worth aiming at, which is part of the advantage of hierarchies, right? Which is something we should talk about because you can't aim at something without privileging it over something else. And if you don't have anything to aim at, then you don't have any purpose in your life, and that's a bloody catastrophe. So anyways, they come up with a vision and they're trying to be more responsible. And then the individualism aspect of this is, you know, I've outlined to people that they're to take responsibility for themselves, which is not the same thing as to be individually selfish.
What?
And to do that in a way that also
Stan denied
makes
my
them
Velcro
responsible
Sophie.
for their family, and to do that in a way that also makes them responsible for the community. So the individualism isn't the selfish individualism that the leftists are criticizing by any stretch of the imagination. It's the individual positioned in an iterated game, right, that includes them as individuals stretched across time. So there's already a collective in that in some sense, and then them in relationship to family and the community. But stemming from the individual outward, which I think is part and parcel of the Judeo-Christian Enlightenment philosophy. Anyways, these people come and tell me this story, and they say they were in a bad place and that things have improved a lot, and they're kind of sad about the bad place part and visibly upset often, and then they tell me how things are improved, and they're really happy about that, and it's very touching and emotional, and that's where caring takes place. That's right at the level of the individual. I went into a Whole Foods yesterday, and this happens quite often, and so I was there, and two of the guys from behind the meat counter came out separately, and they said that they had been watching my lectures, and one of them talked about the fact that, you know, he has a 7-year-old son, and that he wants to do right by him, that he's been looking really hard for ethical and moral guidance, and that he's been reading and listening to my book and concentrating on the parts about telling the truth and not lying. And I'm having these conversations with people one at a time about them striving hard to develop an ethical, philosophically grounded ethical perspective, you know, and it's so interesting to see this happening and to see who's doing it.
Well, this is I think an important point, is that I get asked a lot, because I do get so much criticism and flack. I get asked a lot, have I ever been confronted in public? Because I go out in public, you know, with my family to Disneyland, went on Thanksgiving to Disneyland, and I got, you know, accosted, not accosted, but people came up to me because they like my stuff or they enjoy it and they want to take pictures. Probably happened 35 to 40 times over the course of the day. And they asked me, has there ever been a situation where somebody came up to you and said something mean or nasty? I can't think of one. I can't think of one time this has ever happened. Now online, that's all I get. And so the point here is that when it comes to individuals who are affected and who actually feel good or bad about you, it's a collective mob mentality that allows people to protest you and then protest me, and then that is picked up. The mob mentality is picked up by individual journalists who see themselves as sort of champions of the people broadly, but not champions of individuals, because you still can't find the individual who's been victimized by Jordan Peterson. You still can't find the individual who's been victimized by Dave Rubin, or the individual who's been victimized by Ben Shapiro. You can't find those people. So instead what it becomes is, oh, it's a broader group that's victimized, but none of those people have ever come to me personally and said, you victimized me, you hurt me, because they can't name a situation in which this has happened.
Well, I always love when they say that we're radicalizing people. And it's like, if I open up my inbox, I'm getting emails from all sorts of people, usually on the right, who say that they were a little more extreme on the right, and that because they see a decent liberal who will treat them with respect, they've modified some of their opinions. But what do you think about this just at a psychological level, the disconnect between what seems to be happening in the real world on a day-to-day basis and the way a huge amount of people are behaving online? What do you think is psychologically happening?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, it could easily be, like, if you think of venues like Twitter, let's take Twitter as an example, we don't really understand much about how people communicate, period, psychologically. One of the things that psychologists do know is that if there's any distancing between you and a person, so for example, if you're inside a car, you're much more likely to act in an impulsive and hostile manner. And that, because one of the things that seems to mitigate against that impulsive hostility is whatever mechanisms kick in when you're face to face with someone. So those might be mechanisms that are associated with innate sympathy, for example. And so that regulates your behavior. And because most of the time in our evolutionary history, you were interacting directly one-on-one with someone, that seemed to work out quite well.
Cavemen weren't doing it.
No. They had to carve in insults into walls, and that took a lot of time. And so, but insults into walls. No. They had to carve in insults into walls, and that took a lot of time. And so, but on Twitter, like, it could easily be. I read this little article here a while back showing what words needed to be in content for those to be most likely retweeted, and they were almost all high-level negative emotion words. And so, it could be you have this huge pool of people, and then it might be that only the person who's in a bad mood and is irritated that day, or is sort of chronically like that, or dispositionally like that, let's say,
the first guy,
and who is specifically angry about something that they saw right then, is likely to tweet. And so that gives you this tremendously skewed view of the consensus, because you assume, like, if there's 100 people that show up in a mob outside your door, you assume that there's more than 100 people mad at you, right? They're a representative of a much larger group. On Twitter, you can't tell if the 30 people who say snarky things, especially anonymously to you, you can't tell if they're representative at all. And they're likely not. And you know, that very narrow bandwidth, that 140 or 280 characters, might also be something that really facilitates angry, impulsive responding. And so we don't understand any of this psychologically.
I mean, I think there's something else happening too, and that is that both Twitter and Facebook, all social media, is basically something different in human history in the sense that it's just a crowd without a purpose. So it's a crowd looking for a purpose. Meaning that throughout human history, when you actually had to have face-to-face interactions with people, the only reason you would show up in a crowd is because the crowd had a purpose. So where were you typically doing this? Is you were going to a church, right? Everybody was there to worship. Everybody was there with a common goal in mind, right? You were a member of the army, and so there's a common goal in mind. Anytime you were getting together, it was because there was a party, so everybody was there for the party. Twitter is legitimately people waking up and just, I want to interact with other humans. There are no other humans around. And so I'm here, and you're here, and we're all here. And look, somebody just said something. Ah, there's a common purpose. Let's jump on that. And then there's this backslapping effect of the person said something, and I mean, we all use Twitter, so we all know that if you are, the most dangerous thing about Twitter, if I could do anything with Twitter, I would get rid of the mentions tab. The reason being because if you are if you're just a human, it encourages bad behavior, especially because it encourages you to be looking and seeing how people are responding to you. Because as human beings, we're constantly looking to see how people are responding to us, and so this
Which is generally a good thing.
Right, it's generally a good thing, except that it's an ego machine.
Yes, so that's the downside.
Because one of the keys to being a good person is to recognize most people aren't thinking about you 95% of the time, right? You're not that important as a human. And so in order for you to be important, you actually do something important. But because Twitter functions in such a way that all you get is that feedback loop, it encourages you more and more to look for more of that feedback. It makes you feel good. I mean, you get a little endorphin rush every time there's a nice comment about you. You're fresh for more nice comments. That doesn't happen in real life. There's never a situation in real life in which that happens, and when it does, it's a major life event. It's a wedding, it's a bar mitzvah, right? It's something where people are collectively celebrating you. But on Twitter, everybody is collectively celebrating everybody else, and the people who issue the strongest opinions are the people who receive both the most condemnation and the most celebration.
So in a weird way, not that we want people to go into their bubbles, but are these town squares they're almost too big to actually ever function properly. So every week there's another story where Jack says, I'm going to get rid of the likes, or I'm going to get rid of follower accounts. And they're always trying to float these ideas to manipulate how we all behave with each other. But in an odd way, having everyone from everywhere on these platforms really doesn't make sense in some bizarre way. I'm not saying that we should be on separate platforms.
Well, there's no community.
Yeah, because
which is Ben's point.
Right, so it's like we need something that has community, I think, but then the danger is that we end up in our little echo chamber.
Right, I mean, the need, it's fascinating because if you look at other places on the internet, just structurally, the way that the community works is a little bit different. The way that it works, or it used to work 10 years ago when people actually visited websites directly, was that you'd have something like a National Review The Corner, and it was a bunch of people, you know, like us, sitting around and discussing ideas back and forth, like a group blog.
Yeah.
And it was restricted to the people who were discussing the ideas. And then below that,
or a video game board or anything else.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and then below that you'd have the comment section, which was all about those particular conversations. Because Twitter is fragmented, there's no actual conversation taking place on Twitter. There's me saying something and you responding to it, and me not responding to you mostly, and then me tweeting another thought, and then you responding to it. And the idea of having a long-form conversation, every time it happens on Twitter,
the last guys are
in a
in
conversation, you find someone saying, this isn't the appropriate place to have a long-form conversation. If we were going to do that, we'd be on a podcast, we'd be writing each other letters. Like this isn't the way to do that. And even when I'm discussing with my peers, even when I'm talking with people on the left who I talk with on the phone, instead of having a conversation on Twitter about the topic, I will pick up the phone and call them and have the conversation, because you can't have a good conversation on Twitter. You just can't.
How much of this is connected to one of the things that you've brought up in many of the lectures, which is that we're just getting information so much faster right now. We can not only just open up our phone and have basically the world right there, but we can listen to podcasts in double speed, which if you listen to Shapiro in double speed.
You go back in time, actually.
But yeah, I listen to you in half speed and it's still a little fast.
You sound drunk, yeah.
But just the nature of the technology, how it's just speeding up our ability to take in information. Maybe we haven't evolved fast enough.
Well, it's also we're taking in kind of pseudo information, because it looks like information, but it's really low resolution, and so you get a lot of it, but it's not real knowledge. It's like, there was a funny New Yorker cartoon where the wife asked her husband, do you know that, or do you just Google know it?
Right,
which
exactly.
is right, and so and the
Is somebody to kill the
thing
limp guy?
about those shallow media interactions is that you also don't have to take any
you're still
responsibility
Asia.
for them. You know, especially if you're anonymous, and that also brings out the worst in people. You know, and the trolling phenomena. I mean, one of the things you notice about children, for example, is if children don't get enough good attention, they'll certainly go after bad attention because the fundamental human currency is attention. And it's one thing to be hated, but it's another thing entirely to be ignored. And I would say, generally speaking, if you put people in a corner and you made them choose, you know, if they had knowledge that was transparent to themselves, said, well, would you rather be ignored or hated? They'd take hated because at least then you exist, because you exist, at least in some part, in your relationship to other people. And so some of the bad behavior is rewarded precisely for that reason, is that it does draw attention and that does make you signify. I mean, you think about the people who do heinous crimes like the school shooters, people like that who do these things that are almost inconceivable. A huge part of the drive for that is fantasies about notoriety and the emergence from obscurity and anonymity. Even though it's notorious, it's hatred.
他应该有这么凶
The
，I think I must
idea
be.
is, I'd rather be dead and infamous than alive and anonymous.
Which, by the way, you, I think, were one of the first websites to say we're not going to publish these people's names because then
No,
we're giving them
the-
exactly what they
Yeah,
want.
exactly.
The dilemma one.
There have been, I don't want to take credit as like the first, because there are several.
Oh, I won!
Their names escape me, but there are other people who have been promoting this for a while. But yeah, I was late to it. We should have done it earlier.
And I talked to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation about that about 10 years ago.
Should I sell away my
The
3-star
idea that
videos?
publicizing the names of these killers is precisely
Okay,
one
we'll
of the
do it.
mechanisms that ensures that it will continue to happen, and there's no doubt about that. Now, how to mitigate against that is very complicated.
Well, I mean, and that does tie to a deeper conversation. Did you see this study that was from the CDC that came out that, again, for the second straight year, life expectancy in the United States dropped? So we had consistent life expectancy increases in the United States for 150 years, and now, for the first time in modern American history, life expectancy has now dropped for 2 years in a row, and that's specifically due to two phenomena. One is the increase in heroin overdoses, and the other is suicide. Suicide is now at record rates in the modern era, and we had 70,000 heroin overdoses, opiate overdoses.
No, my LT
last
cannot.
year.
Interrupted.
It was 50,000 the year before, and so you're starting to see life expectancy decline. There's a crisis of meaning, and that's why. And I think that part of the resistance to, particularly I think Jordan,
Oh,
but
GG,
I think
I
also
lost.
to me and to anyone else in the IDW who's at least searching for meaning, is that the left has been saying for a long time that we found the meaning. Right? The meaning
Yeah, I know,
was
right?
do what you want to do. The meaning was
Oh,
no
how did I get
responsibility,
fifth,
do what
yeah?
you
That's
want
so
to do.
strong.
That's the meaning. The meaning is rebelling against the system, and when it turns out that a lot of people don't find meaning in that there is, in my perspective, a God-shaped hole in people's heart that is being filled by hatred and polarization and tribalism.
Or that you just can't do it forever. No one can maintain that level forever of trying to tear everything down. all
Well,
the time,
it's also
right?
there's nothing in it, especially as your opponent weakens. You know, this is we thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about hierarchy. So you know, the thing about
Carbon
one of the
Leblanc.
things a hierarchy does is
Oh yeah, Carbon Leblanc sounds like
fundamentally is put some things above other things. And you think, well, the left criticism of that, which is a valid criticism, is that if you erect a hierarchy, well, let me step one step back. We'll walk through this in a bit of a sequence. Okay, so the first proposition would be
What the
we do have
hell?
real problems.
The Coven?
Because people suffer, and like we have real problems, and we would also
Look
like to
at the
solve them.
Leblanc. Leblanc just
And
shoot,
that
die,
solutions
shoot,
do
die,
exist.
shoot, die.
And that if you have a solution and then you implement it socially, and so you have to get people to cooperate and compete around the solution, you're going to produce a hierarchy. And if the hierarchy is valid, then the people who are the best at producing the solution to the problem are going to lead the hierarchy.
You and your
Okay, so that
psychos
would be a
characters.
conservative right-wing position. It's like, we need hierarchies, they privilege values, and they're necessary to solve problems, and there is a relationship between the ability to solve the problem and the structure of the hierarchy. Okay, so when we'd say that's true when hierarchies are functioning well. Okay, so that's the right-wing viewpoint. And then the left-wingers would say, wait a second, your hierarchy gets rigid over time and ossifies and can be occupied by people who use power instead of competence to dominate it, and they do that unfairly, and they warp the structure of the hierarchy, and that makes it difficult for people to gain entry, including talented people. And then the hierarchy itself, as a structure, has a problem because dispossessed people tend to stack up at the bottom. And that all seems relevant and true, right? So then you could say, well, You need the right because you need the hierarchy.
Oh, he killed the Leblanc.
And they need to be
Hey, no,
implemented.
the Leblanc
That's
killed
what
you.
managers and administrators do. That's what conscientious people do, because they're hierarchically oriented.
Nice.
It's a very efficient way of operating, and people are actually happier within hierarchies because
Nice.
there's an identifiable chain of command. But then the left has its position, which is, yeah, but you got to watch out for